rainforest, heading towards a jungle. So when we look at what species and what type of plants form those assemblies of what we call weeds or pioneer plants, we can get some ideas of how we should mimic and how we should design our edible landscapes. So when you clear land here, you're going to see a variety of hardy grasses, vines, herbaceous weeds, many thorny plants, and often opportunistic legumes. So depending on exactly where you are, you can have different species, but you often have the same general mix of species. So by modeling our gardens after these natural systems, we take advantage of some of these natural processes that are occurring, that will occur, for millennia as long as we don't disrupt the systems. So these examples of these would be nutrient cycling, groundwater recharge, carbon sequestration, evaporative cooling, nitrogen fixation, beneficial fungi and microbial activity, predatory organisms, and diverse symbiotic relationships. So having a garden that's in a row setting, only one level of plants, that's the furthest away from that natural succession that I described. When you clear land, you don't see one type of plant coming and it's very neat and clean underneath it. You see a wild mix. That's why our garden should look a little more wild. You can have a manicured version of wild, but by having these multiple species with ground covers and shrubs and vines and all these things I described, you're leveling the playing field a little bit. Having a manicured garden where everything's one level and perfect and clean on the ground is the farthest away from nature that you can get. Therefore, it's going to require the most energy to maintain that system. The more we can mimic our landscapes or farms after a natural system, the more we take advantage of these natural processes and synergies, and the less energy we have to put into the system, which is very important, especially when you're talking about the home landscape, where often you have a job and you have a whole life, and this is more of just something on the side. It's not your job. So you want this to be easy and productive. You don't want to be spending all your time and effort dealing with this. So we're going to talk a little bit about the species. So like I said, we have multiple levels. We have canopy trees, we have mid-level trees, we have smaller trees, we have herbaceous layers, we have ground covers, we have vines. So some examples of canopy trees, these are going to be the biggest trees in your landscape. These terms are all relative because if you have a really small yard, your tallest tree might be only 20 feet. So your canopy tree might not be on this list, it might be on the next list, depending on what size space you have to work with. If you have a bigger space, you can go with the tallest species. And almost all of these species can be pruned for size control except for palms. You can't prune palms unless you're just going to kill them. So even though mangoes can become 130 feet tall, there's many people who manage mangoes at 10 or 12 feet. So by heavily pruning, especially using grafted trees, you can put a lot more trees into one area. That's something to consider. Even though I have mangoes on this list, and they can become, like I said, more than 100 feet, they can also be very productive at 8 to 12 feet with management. So some of these canopy species would be coconut, red nut, breadfruit, jackfruit, avocado, acai palm, peach palm, sapodilla, mango, tamarind, cashew, inga or ice cream bean, also known as brie here, mami sapote, holly apple, monkey apple, ramon, also known as the local red nut, and macadamia nut in some areas. So everybody knows coconut. If you have any kind of edible landscape, you should have coconut in it. It's kind of a no-brainer. It's one of the most useful plants on earth. It provides water, it provides coconut meat, it provides coconut oil. You can use the husks for multiple purposes. You can use the shell itself for various uses. The leaf can be used for thatch and on and on and on. So coconut's a great species. There's many varieties. There's some that are considered dwarf. They still can become 20 feet or more high, but they start to bear at a lower size compared to what are known as the tall varieties of coconuts that typically don't bear until 8 to 10 feet, and they can become very tall, up to 100, 130 feet or more in height. So the dwarf varieties aren't really going to stay 10 feet forever. They're going to start bearing lower and then not reach the insanely heights of the 100 plus foot tall varieties. So breadfruit. This is the crop that is pretty common in Belize, but it seems to be becoming less common. I think it's one that everyone should have if they have the space for. Breadfruit's an excellent crop. It's one of the most productive staple crops on earth. It's very diverse in its uses. You can make bread you can make flour out of breadfruit, you can make bread, you can boil it, you can fry it, you can make porridge out of it. there's a number of uses for breadfruit. So I definitely recommend planting breadfruit. That's something that we've been working with a lot in Rancho Dolores with tropical agroforestry. We're planting a lot of breadfruit on the farm there, and it makes a beautiful plant in edible landscape. Breadfruit can become very large and kind of scraggly if they're pruned. If you can see, I have a better picture later on. This is the side. You can see a little bit of it here. But if you prune some of these trees when they're young, they can become much more bushy and beautiful. If you just plant the breadfruit and never do anything, it's going to become massive and very lengthy. It's going to have long branches and it will break easily. By pruning the breadfruit, you can have a much more bushy and productive tree. There's also varieties that are more bushy than others. This is a new variety to Belize that's not available yet. In a few years, we hope to have it available, but it's called Ma'afala. And it's a naturally dwarfing breadfruit. It branches more densely and it stays much shorter. So it does have a tendency to stay smaller than these other varieties, but it's only been here for 3 years now, so it will become a larger tree, but it has a tendency to be a little bit more semi-dwarf or bushy. So breadfruit's a species that, from our experience, definitely does better in a multi-species planting. It's one of these type of plants that likes a little bit more rainfall than we get, in this part of the country. It does better heading into Stand Creek and to the northern part of Toledo. It does great in certain parts of Coyote, but I've seen a lot of really beat up trees around here because they're in open settings. If you put a breadfruit where the roots stay shaded, like if you have afternoon shade, they'll do a lot better typically. They can take full sun, but they have a pretty high water demand, and they like pretty good soil. So if you have a breadfruit in a less than ideal condition, it'll do better, especially when it's young and partial shade, and even when it's mature with afternoon shade. Afternoon sun is the hottest sun of the day. So if you're planting your yard and you're thinking about where does this one plant go, let's say cacao, you don't want to put it on the west side of your house where it stays shaded all morning and then it gets the hottest, harshest sun in the afternoon from 1 o'clock until sunset. The hottest, driest sun of the day is the afternoon sun always. So if you have a species that's sensitive to sunlight, like cacao or black pepper or vanilla, or if you're in a marginal climate for things like breadfruit or other species that I'm going to talk about, putting it in a spot, thinking about where you're placing that tree is very important because the tree can do much better if it's put in the right place. Even if it's literally only 30 feet away from the other place, it can be a world of difference depending on how the sun affects that area and how that area is drained and a number of issues. Oh, here we go. Here's a better picture of the Ma'afala. You can see the full tree. So it's a more bushy variety. It wants to stay a little shorter. Some of the trees are already bearing at about 8 feet, and they're nice and dense and thick trunk and bushy. So this is, I think, going to be a better variety for edible landscaping. Here's a little picture of some food that you can make from this stuff. The whole end goal is to eat it, basically, so I didn't want us to forget that goal. Here's a picture on the right-hand side of breadfruit, and that is just sliced breadfruit fried in coconut oil. On the left-hand side is jackfruit that we made into what we call like a jackfruit meat. And that's basically taking the jackfruit, which we're going to talk about on the next slide. You peel it, boil it, then you would saute it with a variety of herbs and spices. So they're both very delicious crops, and that was a very filling meal made with just 2 fruits from our yard, and a couple of herbs and spices from the yard too. So here's a picture of jackfruit. Jackfruit's a pretty impressive tree to have in your edible landscape. If you haven't seen the tree, it's really a breathtaking tree to see. Jackfruit is the largest tree-borne fruit in the world. In India, fruits have reached up to 180 pounds apiece. The biggest I've heard of in Belize is about 75 pounds coming from Rancho Dolores. But they can become much larger if you were to thin the fruit. Most large fruit you see, the fruit have been thinned to reduce the amount of fruit on the tree or the vine. And that's true with a lot of our fruits here. Like you see the big guavas in the market. Those have always been thinned, where almost half of the fruit's removed to let those other fruits get larger. So the same thing can be done with jackfruit. This one has more than 100 fruit on this tree here. If we were to have thinned that to only 4 fruit, maybe some could get up to 80, 90 pounds. But we don't really want to do that because no one wants an 80 or 90 pound fruit here. So jackfruit overall is very diverse. You can eat the young leaves of jackfruit. You can eat the young flowers of it, the young fruit in multiple stages. They have different uses, all the way up to the ripe fruit. The ripe fruit is edible seeds also that can be boiled and used like a bean or a potato. And overall, it's one of the most nutritious and multi-use trees that are out there. It's a beautiful tree. The ripe fruit is very sweet. If you haven't had it before, I definitely recommend trying it. It kind of has a mango, banana, pineapple. It's a familiar taste, but a unique and a different taste. So jackfruit's very easy to grow. It grows very fast. It can bear within 2 years from seed. Usually it's 3 to 5 years from seed, but it can grow 10 feet in the first year. A lot of times I've seen trees in Florida, and I've seen some here as well. Within 2 years, they're getting near 20 feet already. They start to slow down after the first 6 years, but the first 6 years, the tree can be 30, 40 feet easily. But it can be pruned for size control also. You're not going to prune a jackfruit as small as we talked about, like a mango being 10 or 12 feet. It wants to become a little larger of a tree, and you'll see if you have it. But it can be kept less than 20 feet. This tree here, the picture didn't look as blurry on the last slide, I think because the screen's kind of tilted that's giving it that effect. This tree here is actually a very short tree. It's only about 20 feet, but it had well over 100 fruit on it. And the cool thing about jackfruit is, we'll see it with a few of our other fruits, it has what we call califery, where it produces fruit out of the trunk of the tree itself. And you can see the ground is right there, and on this picture, on this same tree, 10 or 12 of the fruit were actually laying on the ground like melons. So they grow out of the trunk of the tree, but the fruit lays on the ground. So it's a very weird tree. You don't see that very often. Other examples of califery we have here would be things like balimbi, cacao, some types of ingas produce in that way. Mamey produces in that way, but not on the lower trunk, but on the branches. Jackfruit's definitely the weirdest, where it will actually lay on the ground itself. So it's a great tree to have. Also, the jackfruit, I'd say, can pretty much be grown. It's one of the few trees that can be growing well from the northern tip of Belize all the way to the south. It can take quite a bit of drought, and it can take heavy, heavy rain as well. Coconut's one of the other few examples of a tree that will produce all the way from the north to the south in almost any part of Belize. So here's one we all know and love, mango. It's one of the most popular fruits on earth. There's thousands of varieties of mangoes. There's mangoes that are less than a quarter pound on a ripe fruit, all the way up to 7 pounds each. So there's a ton of different types of mangoes. There's a taste of mango for every different person out there, basically. So a mango is something that you really want to know the variety, where the jackfruit and a lot of these other things, there's not so much difference if you're not really familiar with the fruit. But mango, there's so much variation. You might love one variety and hate the next variety. So I would recommend with the mango, a grafted tree would be preferred, because otherwise you're not going to know what you're going to get, and there's so much variation. Some mangoes are very small and fibrous and kind of sour, where other ones are large and totally fibrous with no strings inside, very sweet. So it really depends on your preference. So mangoes, again, can become very large, up to 100, 130 feet or more, but they can also be pruned for size control. Especially grafted trees can easily be kept 10 or 12 feet high. You can also graft multiple varieties onto one mango tree if you don't have a big area. I've seen a tree with up to 20 varieties grafted onto it in the city in Florida before, so you can do that. There's a few different mango fests that go on in Belize. That's a great place if you haven't tried some of the different mangoes. You could go and try some of the different varieties that exist here. We'll put a little ad for one of our friends here. This is our friend Ali. He's sitting in the front here. He has a stand at Mango Fest every year in Hopkins, and he has a really good collection of mangoes down there, and some friends with good collections as well. And he picks the different mangoes and has a nice display at the fest every year, and you can come sample stuff. He has trees available there as well. So that's a great place every year to try different mangoes at the Hopkins Mango Fest. So Kaimito is another tree. There's some planted here in the landscape I've seen around the showgrounds. It's a very beautiful tree. It's also known as star apple in some areas. It has a very beautiful leaf. That's probably the best part about it. It has a dark green leaf with a copper gold color underside, so when the breeze blows, it shows two different colors, and it's a very beautiful tree. The fruit itself is either green skinned or purple skinned, and there's multiple varieties, but the main, are either green or purple. I prefer the green type, is sweeter to me. Some people like the purple one, better, so it just depends on your preference. The fruit is kind of a jelly-like inside. It's a different fruit. It's native to Central and South America. It's a very interesting fruit, and it's different than a lot of stuff. If you've never tried it before, I'd recommend it. It's not a fruit that everybody loves, but I think it's a great fruit, and it's very nice. It's easy to grow. And the nice thing about it is it fruits here it fruits anywhere from February until April or so. So it's in a good season when not a lot of stuff's producing. So acai, this is a type of palm. It's very common in South America, especially in Brazil. This is what people call a superfood plant, and many of these are what we call superfoods. It's a palm fruit. It's not a very flavorful fruit, but it has one of the highest antioxidant levels of any palm that you could grow, or any kind of fruit in Belize. There are higher antioxidant levels in other plants in the world, but this is one of the best that you could grow easily in the tropics. It's a clumping palm that has multiple trunks. The palm heart itself, the palmito, is very good. It can be eaten raw, also as cooked or steamed. So it's a great crop where you have the berries itself and you have the palm hearts. It's a very ornamental plant. It looks like a lot of your standard clumping ornamental palms. I'm trying to think of the name of the one. Areca palms or things like that. It looks a lot like that, but it's edible and useful. So that's a good one. So tamarind, this one is also known as tamarind here in Belize. This can be a very large tree. It's a slower growing tree. It can be kept at more of a medium size by pruning, but it can become very massive if you let it. Tamarinds are one of the oldest trees that we're going to talk about here. Tamarinds and mangoes, they can live for hundreds of years and still produce. There's tamarinds in India. Some they say are up to 1,000 years old with just massive trunks and really gnarled look to them, and they still produce fruit occasionally. So tamarind typically here is used as a juice. As most people know, you can make jelly out of it. You can eat it. You can make candy out of it. There's a lot of different uses. There's even sweet varieties of tamarinds too that I have some trees of. I've got the seeds over in Cayo that have no sourness at all. You don't have to put any kind of sugar or anything. You can eat the fruit. There's no tartness to it. You can make juice with no sugar also. So that's something that's more common. You see those sweet varieties in Thailand and Southeast Asia, but they do have plants here. So another one we're going to talk about is inga or ice cream bean. It's known here as brie. This is a really common tree. It's a wild tree. There also are different cultivated varieties. This is a picture of a wild one here that we planted. It's a young wild tree. It's a nitrogen fixing tree also, so it's a really important tree to have in your edible landscape. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But the idea that there's certain plants that we call nitrogen fixing. Most of these plants are in the bean family or the legume family. And many people have heard about when you plant corn, people often plant beans after the corn. That's because the beans themselves are nitrogen fixing, like the inga and like many other species. A really popular one that you see a lot here, it's a wild tree. We have the park right across the street. It's the guanacaster tuberous tree. It does have edible pulp on the seed, but it's a really great nitrogen fixing tree also. So many trees, not all, but many trees that have this fine feathery leaves like the tuberous or the guanacast does are nitrogen fixing. Some are not. Tamarind looks like that, but it's not nitrogen fixing. But many of the trees that are feathery leaf is what I call it, like the tuberous, are nitrogen fixing. There's a whole bunch of different ingas in Belize. They look a little bit different. These are really important plants. They're a great mulch source for your garden as well. So by planting these ingas or other nitrogen fixing trees in your garden, you can actually provide fertilizer basically to the plants. And how that works, we're not going to get too deep into it. These nitrogen fixing plants have a natural symbiotic relationship with soil-borne bacteria. And those soil-borne bacteria, they form a relationship and they live on the roots of these plants. So the air that we breathe right now is 60 to 70% nitrogen. But that's in a form that most plants can't utilize. It's just floating around in the air and most plants can't do anything with it. These nitrogen fixing plants, they also can't do anything with it. But on their roots, these bacteria live that have evolved with those plants. Those bacteria, when that plant respires, they can take in that nitrogen and they can convert it to a form that is usable to plants. So by having guanacast or brie or a number of different species, modern day cacao is another common one you see here, or you could plant ground covers like we'll talk about a little later, like perennial peanut and other species, you can provide a very real amount of nitrogen, which is an important fertilizer source for your garden. Nitrogen is often one of the limiting nutrients. Most soils, especially ones that have been farmed before, have very low nitrogen levels. So by having these plants, you're really increasing the fertility of your land. By having 30% of your canopy, if 30% of your canopy trees or your tallest trees are nitrogen fixing, or if 70% of your ground covers and lower plants are nitrogen fixing, that will provide typically all the nitrogen you'll need for your system. So by having 30% of the trees nitrogen fixing or 70% of the ground cover. So that would equal roughly 150 pounds of pure nitrogen per acre per year. So that would be equivalent to roughly 5,000 pounds of chicken manure being spread per acre per year. So if you have, 2 acres, it'd be 10,000 pounds. If you have a quarter acre, do the math. But basically, by having these species in your landscape, and I'll talk about some different ones, a little bit later on here, they're providing, some of them, food, habitat for different beneficial organisms, and they're providing free fertilizer for you. By not taking advantage of those systems is really just, it's like wasting money, it's wasting time. These systems are going on, they've gone on way before humans ever came around, and they'll go on long after, and they're very important and can provide real sources of fertility to your garden. So here's a picture of what's known as paterna, and this is a variety of Inga. There's over 600 species of Inga in Central and South America. This is a cultivated one that comes typically from Salvador or Guatemala, but it is growing now in Belize, and you can find it in the market seasonally. This is a very large fruit you can see. There's a white edible pulp on the seed. The front part of the picture, you can see the green seeds. Those have already been cleaned, or the pulp's been eaten off. The ones in the back have not been eaten yet. But the green seeds can actually be boiled and used like a bean substitute. So you can make, you can stew them, you can boil them, you can do a variety of things and use it like a protein staple, like a bean. And that is done pretty commonly in Salvador and Guatemala and in communities here. So here's some pictures of wild Ingas. Like I said, there's over 600 species of Inga. These are 5 different Ingas from the jungle around their farm. Here's a picture of a Male apple in bloom. Many of you know Male apple is a really common fruit here. It makes a nice red to kind of purple colored fruit that's very juicy and soft, has a nice kind of a light rose or flower scent. But the flowers themselves are very, very ornamental. The whole tree will often be pink on the ground underneath the tree. So it's a really beautiful tree to have in your landscape. It can become very large. So a little bit about mid-sized fruit trees. So going over this list, this would be things like star fruit, cacao, white sapote, most of your citrus, Chinese plum or jujube, governor plum, golden plum, May plum, August plum, custard apple, sour sop, Berlinia, sunkoya, ilama, pashte, atamoya, ginip, or also kinip, lychee, alapag, rambutan, wax apple, mulberry, allspice, and cinnamon. So this is star fruit. Many of you have seen this fruit before. It's a really common fruit here in Belize. Star fruit is a very productive tree. It's one of these fruits that produces multiple times a year. I definitely recommend planting fruit trees that fruit more than once a year. If you have a small yard, you want to get the most use out of each square foot. So having trees like star fruit, like various limes and lemons, and some of the different plums, like the dwarf golden plum and guava is another example, they fruit multiple times a year. So I always think it's a great thing to have a tree that fruits more than once. You get more yield out of your space. So there's sweet and sour types of star fruit. The sour types are really better for making juice or jelly or processing. The sweet types are great for eating right out of hand. They're very juicy. They're not really sweet like a mango, but they have a nice, mild, refreshing juiciness. They can be made into a juice. They can make great wine or vinegar as well. So if any of you have any questions while I'm going through this, feel free to just raise your hand or shout out or whatever. Yeah, that's a good point. That comes a little bit later in the slides here. I'm going to go over some of the species first, but just real quick, if we don't get to that, because this is a little bit longer than the 1 hour, so I'm going to try to get through as much as we can. Besides things like the nitrogen-fixing plants we just talked about, a really important thing is managing your fertility. So increasing the organic matter in your soil is really important, and you'll hear that a lot from other speakers here. You can do that by adding compost to the soil, by adding aged manures, and the most important thing to me is mulching. So by mulching around your fruit trees, that can be using leaves, that can be using dried grass, any kind of husks or shells from different crops. If you go look in the jungle, if you go across the street into the jungle over here, you're never going to find barren ground. The ground's never going to be plain just dirt, unless someone came in and raked the leaves away. There's always leaves and there's always ground covers on the ground. Nature abhors bare soil. Nature hates barren ground. Barren ground is equaling nutrient loss, erosion, and overall degradation. So by keeping your ground constantly covered, by putting leaves and mulch, or by putting living ground covers, you're going to increase the fertility a lot in your soil. And there's a lot that's a whole day of talks. But there's a lot of other people who are going to be talking about that today as well, so you can get different ideas on that. But yeah, one of the most important things in an edible landscape is creating that fertility and maintaining the fertility. So by using some of these plants that we're going to discuss, like the different nitrogen fixing plants, that really is adding a lot to that system. So cacao, everyone pretty much knows about cacao. It's a great tree in an edible landscape. It's one of these species that likes shade. It can grow in more sun, especially in marginal areas where it's a little bit drier, like heading into the north. Cacao is going to benefit from being planted in a shadier area, closer to your house where you can water it more often. Going into the south, cacao doesn't really need much care, compared to what it'd have here or going further north. It's a little bit too dry in this region in north, but cacao in the right, sheltered and shaded setting with a little bit of supplemental water will do very well. So one of my favorite fruits, mangosteen. This is a very slow-growing tree, and I'd say on the little bit more of the difficult scale of growing. It's really the most suitable for Stand Creek District and Toledo District, but it can be grown in other districts. It is being grown here in Cayo. It's a little bit more sensitive to its needs. It has a high water demand. It really does not like dry season. You want to plant mangosteen somewhere where it doesn't dry out very much. It doesn't like swampy areas, but it doesn't like to get dry. So it benefits from being planted in shade or semi-shade. The young trees especially need to be shaded. So often people make a little structure out of palm or thatch for the young trees. But this tree can fruit very well its whole life underneath shade. So planting it underneath the big tree like a guanacast or any other large legume trees will really help it. I've seen areas, like for example at the Belize Botanic Gardens, there's a bunch of trees underneath the guanacast of mangosteen, and the ones just outside of that during dry season get really burned up by the dry weather. Even though it's only 10 feet outside of the canopy, where the ones underneath there, they get that little bit of extra dew. In the morning, you have to think, even if it's not raining, these big, massive canopy trees collect dew, and that dew condenses on the leaves and then drops down. So they're getting a little bit of water year-round because of that also. So mangosteen, great crop, can take 5 years or more to come into bearing. This is a picture of mangosteen and abiyu fruit. Abiyu is the big yellow fruit. So abiyu is an excellent fruit also. It's in the same genus as mamey, sapote, and canistel. It's similar inside to the caimito that we talked about, but it's a much sweeter fruit overall. To me, it's a much better version. If you like caimito, this is actually unrelated to caimito, but it's very similar. The Latin name, it's confusing, is, it's Puteria caimito. So even though it's in a different genus, it still has the specific name caimito, but it's unrelated to the fruit. So small fruit trees, these are your lowest fruit trees, would be Suriname cherry, acerola cherry, dwarf mulberry, the dwarf golden plum, dwarf abiyu, there's dwarf soursops, guava, strawberry guava, sour guava, sugar apple, lime, lemon, araza, cocoa plum, grafted crabu, and balimbi. And there's a variety of other things, like I said, but these are just a small example of some of the different shorter trees that you can grow here. So this is guava. Yep. So the first slide I have is guava, and guava is another one of these trees that can become quite tall if you let it grow. It can get up to 50, 60 or more feet, but you're not really going to ever see a guava at that height. Guavas can be maintained as a very short tree, as 6 feet or 7 feet. So guava is one fruit that is very easy to grow the tree, but not so easy to get a really nice ripe fruit. The nice big guavas you see in the market, those are grown, like I said, by thinning the fruit to get that large size, but they're also protecting the fruit by bagging it. When the fruit are really young, the size of a 5-cent piece, often people are putting a mesh bag over the fruit and tying it to keep flies from getting into the fruit. Guava is one of the favorite foods of various fruit flies, and when the fruit are really small, they lay their eggs in the fruit. By the time the fruit's ripe, it's full of worms. So, unfortunately, to really get good guavas in a lot of parts of Belize, you have to bag the fruit. So you can grow guava without that effort, and you can get good fruit sometimes, but especially if you have a lot of other fruit trees around, there's probably fruit fly, and you will have a maggot-filled guava if you don't bag it. So guava is a great tree. It produces very quickly from seed. It produces quickly from air layer or from grafted trees. Some of these trees produce, this little row of trees they're different seedling trees. Some of them produce within a year and a half from seed. So they can be very, very fast growing from seed. From a grafted tree, they're producing in 1 or 2 years, pretty much every time. So there's a lot of different varieties of guavas, just like a lot of these other fruits. Mostly here, all we see are the small local ones that are pink inside, or the big white ones. But there's a ton of different guavas. I've even seen a seedless guava here in Belize from Taiwan. That's a good sized fruit that has no seeds at all in it. It's pretty interesting. There's a couple questions. Yeah, what would happen is they would come to that, and if you didn't collect all the fruit and then destroy the guava fruit, like by burning it or getting rid of it, then they would just hatch and then spread to your other stuff. Okay. So, yeah. If you really like guava and you have a lot of other trees, it's best to clean up your fallen fruit too. Like if you have a bunch of mangoes dropping in different fruits, and you want to reduce the fruit fly population, there's different traps you can use, but also by cleaning up the fallen fruit, you can reduce the amount of fruit fly. But really to get good guavas, chances are you're going to have to bag it, which is not that much work considering how much a guava costs in the market. For one of those big guavas can be $4 or more. Best time to harvest it? Prune it? When the trees are young, the best time to prune it is every time. It depends on how you're trying to shape the tree, but for keeping the trees short, every time that you get about 2 hand lengths of growth away from the last split. So every time you prune a tree, it splits typically into 2. Every time you prune a tree, it usually splits into two branches. Then the new growth comes out as 2. Every time you get a little bit more than 2 hand lengths away from the last split. So I have pretty big hands, so maybe it'd be 2.5 for other people, but it'd be about 1 foot. Every time you get about 1 foot from the last split, you prune it again. You tip it. All you really have to do is, you can use your fingers or a little pair of scissors, is pinch where the new leaf comes out. Just go in between the 2 new leaves and pinch the bud. And then that'll make it split again. If you let the branch grow really long before you split it, then you're going to get one of these big, lanky trees that produces 1 guava here and 1 over here. But typically when the tree gets about, when you guava tree, to keep it these small, short trees you see growing around here commercially, when the tree gets about 1.5 feet off the ground, some people let it get about 2 feet, then they head it or they split it then. Because it comes up as a straight seedling, but when you pinch that young tree back, it splits. So I usually split them before 2 feet. If it's about 18 inches off the ground, you prune it the first time, then it splits. Let it get 2 hand lengths of growth, split it again, tip it again. It'll keep splitting and splitting. Eventually you'll get a lot of bushiness, and you're going to have to thin out some of the interior branches. When you see the guava branches growing like crisscrossing towards the inside of the tree, those aren't going to be very productive. So after the tree gets some good size to it, you're going to come in and remove some of those inner branches with some sharp pruning shears. So by splitting it, we're doing an unnatural thing, and it's creating more than a usual amount of branches. So we have to usually come back in and remove some of those branches so the tree doesn't get too dense and stagnant.
You could also do that with moringa, right? So it produces more leaves instead of growing straight up.
Yep, pretty much every tree can be pruned. Like I said, besides palms, for keeping a tree bushy and short, you can tip prune nearly anything. And there's a whole class you can do on each different species of tree for pruning. Citrus, there's different techniques of pruning. But overall, if you want a plant to be more bushy, by cutting back that, what they call apical tip, the top growing, the main head, if you will, by cutting that back, that makes it split and branch again. Any other questions on that topic?
I have a question on a different topic. It refers to earlier you were talking about how some fruit trees were better to grow in southern Belize because there's more rain, and then some may not be suited for here in Cairo area. So the question is, because Belize is one of the few English-speaking countries in the tropical world on this continent, we have troubles finding resources for some of the stuff you're talking about. Most of the only references we have are like southern Florida, or a lot of Florida fruit growing books, right? So I was wondering if there was some sort of way to gauge, because it has to do with rainfall versus temperature versus the soil type. So is there any resources for us people interested in growing exotic fruit trees here in Belize?
Not the definitive work for just Belize in general. It's really looking around your area, because there's a lot of stuff's being grown already. So all the stuff I'm pretty much talking about here can be grown easily in Cairo Stand Creek. I don't have the experience in Toledo as much, but I know from visiting what stuff does do better, just generally speaking, but I don't have really much experience in the north, but the north gets very similar rainfall to Florida. From visiting there, it is more similar to where I grew up in Florida, where you can't grow, you don't see breadfruit as much there, you don't see mangosteen there. So Florida's a little bit more on that 55 inches of rain a year, a little bit cooler, a little bit drier conditions. We're coming into Cayo, heading down to Hummingbird. You're getting a lot more of what we call truly tropical conditions, where you have more consistent temperatures, less harsh of a dry season, more consistent rainfall. So you're able to plant more of what we call the truly tropical fruits. Like you see more things like the mangosteen and rambutan and alipag and a variety of different things. All right. Another question? Sure.
Going back to the pruning, suppose the main branch is thick, you did not prune it in time enough. And when you prune that, do you have to paint it with some kind of resin or something to protect it from?
No, you don't have to. I typically don't do that. Some people do, and we can ask around and after I talk and see what other people might mention. But typically it's best, if you're going to cut a big branch like that back, to do it heading into the wet season, but not when it's wet yet, like when it's still dry, but not in the beginning of the dry season. Sometimes if you cut a tree back hard in the beginning of the dry season, it'll put out a lot of new growth, then it gets really dry and that new growth's more soft and it'll die down. If you cut it in the wet season, sometimes it can get fungus or have more issues with rotting. But if you cut it, let's say, a month before, in May, let's say going into June, going into the wet season, it would be better. Also, doing an angled cut would be better than a flat cut. So any water that's going to sit there is going to run off versus sitting stagnant there. So you can literally take a tree. If you have a mango tree that got way too big in your yard, it's 100 feet tall, and you never see any mangoes except ones that, smash like a tortilla on the ground, you can take a mango tree and just cut it back to a stump, to a short tree. It's going to take a lot of effort then to shape it into a nice tree again. It's going to have 1,000 branches coming up. But you can take most species of the trees, like I said, besides palms, and cut them back hard and re-prune them again. You can reshape them. You can take a tree to the ground, a big mango, and within 1 year it's already a nice tree again. Within 2 years it's fruiting good again. So I'll mention it real quickly. There's two main types of golden plums you see here. In the market, the big one you see is typically the standard, the full-size golden plum. Some people say it's a different species. It's Spondius cytherea. The dwarf golden plum in this picture is Spondius dulcis. The dwarf golden plum is probably the fastest tree that fruits from seed. Within 6 months of planting a seed of the dwarf golden plum, you can have fruit already. And it's one of these trees that basically fruits nonstop. It flowers and fruits pretty much year-round. So if you have a very small yard, I would definitely recommend a dwarf golden plum if you like the fruit. It's mostly eaten here like as it's partially green when it's getting towards ripe, peeled and dipped in salt or dipped in salt and pepper. It's a nice fruit. It can be used in salads too. When it's fully ripe, you can make juice out of it, jelly, wine, a variety of things. Huh? Just plant it. Yeah, if you plant the seed, a lot of the seedlings will start bearing within 6 months with very little care. These can take partial sun. Usually I've grown them in partial sun, not full sun, where it maybe gets afternoon shade but they can take full sun and they can take partial shade as well. This is the custard apple. All of you probably know custard apple. It's a great fruit. It's very easy to grow, especially going into the north more. It doesn't like as much rainfall, so maybe it doesn't do as good in the south. I'm not sure. But I know from here, going up towards the north, it does very, very well, especially over in Cayo and the rockier areas. There's many different varieties of custard apple. The main ones you see here are the red flesh type, red skin and red flesh. You see the pink one, and you see the yellow skin or white skin with white flesh. They're all very good, but I prefer the pink one or the one that has the white skin. This is Balimbi. This picture you really can't see on this tilted slide here. It's a relative of starfruit. It's a very small tree. It also fruits off the trunk like the jackfruit with that cauliflory we talked about. It's a very sour fruit that's usually made into juice or jelly or preserves. So, Okay. So it's nearly time because we got started late. So I'm going to go over a few more things kind of quickly. But again, think of any questions you have at all. It's all about y'all learning something. I'm not going to be able to go over everything because of our little bit of delay. So really quickly, we have the mid-herbaceous layer. That's the next layer down from our smaller fruit trees. That would be things like banana, plantain, chaya, moringa, pigeon pea, papaya, sugarcane, keituk, edible hibiscus, cassava, and coffee. So bananas are one thing that, all of us eat the banana as a sweet fruit, but banana is a great staple crop too. And many of you have had bananas in that fashion where it's boiled, baked, roasted, fried. Green banana is a great crop that can be a big staple part of your diet as well. So it's not just about eating ripe bananas as a snack or whatever. Green bananas are a very important staple crop, just like green plantains are too. And very easy to grow. Coffee. So the low herbaceous layer, which would be our shorter plants, not our lowest plants, which would be the ground covers, but this is our nearly the lowest level, which would be pineapple, cocoa yam, malanga, which is similar to cocoa yam, taro, which is known here as edo, water spinach, ginger, turmeric or yellow ginger, oregano, basil, mint, culantro, Chinese leeks or garlic chives, green onions, habanero peppers, other perennial peppers, arrowroot, pumpkins, edible hibiscus species. That's yellow ginger with pineapple behind it. This is a picture of different types of edible gingers I was growing in Florida. There's many different varieties of edible gingers of many species. I'm not going to go into that right now. This is sorrel or roselle. This is actually an annual plant. It's a long season annual, but it's a very ornamental plant. Many of you have had the juice before. I think they're actually selling it over here today. But it's a very beautiful hibiscus relative. It only lives for one season, but it's a long season plant. There's other edible perennial hibiscus like cranberry hibiscus. There's another one called edible leaf hibiscus, which supposedly they have down in Toledo also. Very good crops. So on the right-hand side of this jungle mess here is pigeon pea. That's not a very common plant in Belize anymore. It used to be pretty common in the north and in central Belize called gongo bean. It's more popular in Jamaican communities. People call it pigeon peas or peas. If you hear peas and rice, that's more of pigeon pea. And pigeon pea is a perennial bean tree or bush. It can get up to 15 feet high, but usually it stays at about 8 or 9 feet. And it's like the sorrel, it's day length sensitive, which means that it grows and grows and grows. If you plant it in, let's say you plant it in May, it'll keep growing and growing with no flowering or any production until you get into the shorter days. Like right now, it's starting to flower in November. So it'll flower and produce November, December, January. Then you harvest it. Then it usually produces again coming into March and April. So you really only get 2 crops a year out of it, but it will grow, continuously the rest of the year. So it will not fruit or flower until the days get shorter and it triggers that flowering, which is also seen in the sorrel as well. So lemongrass or fever grass, cassava. One of the last, I'm going to go over 2 more plants. Cassava is one I will go over. One of the easiest plants to grow. It's the highest yielding carbohydrate staple per acre. You can get 60,000 pounds of cassava per acre per year. So it's an incredible crop. It's very digestible. It's not a very minerally rich crop. It doesn't have the mineral content like sweet potato has. But in terms of a good staple for your diet, cassava is very easy to grow. It's very healthy for you, and it yields like crazy. You can do a lot of different stuff with cassava. It can be made into flour and tortillas and bread and crackers and cakes and all kinds of sweets. It can be boiled. It can be baked. It can be fried. It can be roasted. You can make wine. You can do all kinds of stuff with cassava. It's a very versatile crop, and it's the easiest crop to grow. If you can't grow cassava, then you might want to find another hobby because it's very easy to grow. All you do is you take a woody piece of the stem, and there's little, we call it nodes, little nubs, little knuckles on the plant. You put 2 nodes below the ground and 2 nodes above, or you could do 10 below and 10 above, but as long as 2 are below and 2 are above, at least, it's going to grow. Within about 9 months to 12 months, depending on where you are, there are shorter season varieties, you're going to have a good yield. It spoils. Yeah. No, once it gets purple like that, it's basically spoiled. Cassava has a very short shelf life. That's the biggest drawback to cassava as a commercial crop is that the fact that once you harvest it, it starts to deteriorate within 24 hours. One way you can manage that if you're harvesting it at home or if you're trying to sell it in the market, you can defoliate your cassava. If you come into the row you want to harvest and you cut all the leaves off 2 weeks before harvesting, you'll get about an extra week or sometimes up to 2 weeks of shelf life without it turning black like that. So that helps it to toughen off. It doesn't always work. The best thing for home use is to harvest as much cassava as you're going to need for that meal. Don't go harvest your whole cassava section unless you're planning on drying it or processing it in some way, or freezing it is another way you can process it. So once cassava is harvested, it deteriorates and breaks down very quickly, so it's usually seen made into products. Down south, they make it into cassava bread, cassava flour, cassava farina, and once you process it, it has a very long shelf life. Supposedly, cassava bread will last for 5 years without spoiling. That's why you see in South America and Brazil, that's the staple. People make cassava bread, and anytime people are traveling, you carry cassava bread. It can last for 5 years without molding or breaking down. It also tastes like, towards cardboard, in my opinion, but cassava bread, when it's fresh and hot, is very nice. But once it turns dry, it gets a very tough, texture to it, which is not most people's idea of delicious, but it's very easy to grow, and like I said, it's a very great staple crop. Okay. So vine crops, there's a lot of vine crops. Can't go into all of them. I'll go over them quickly. This is a very important component many people don't think about, is that you can actually grow vines up some of your different fruit trees. So these fruit trees can be trellises for your other species of plants. So some, to me, must-haves, I'll point out a couple. Black pepper is a must-have. It grows very easily. Everyone pretty much uses black pepper in cooking. Fresh black pepper that you actually dry and grind yourself is much tastier than the stuff from the store. Passion fruit is another one. It's very easy to grow. It produces very quickly. Makes the best juice that you can get. The true yam, also yampi is another one. It's not grown as much in Belize as some of the other countries around here, but it's a very easy growing plant. It grows kind of out of control. It's a vine that grows up trees or posts, and it yields a lot. It's one of the biggest tubers on earth. I've harvested some in Florida that weighed 75 pounds apiece. In Polynesia, where they have really big varieties, in the Pacific Islands, they can get 150 pounds or more per tuber. So one tuber would take multiple guys to harvest and carry out of the field. The most common one you see here is yampi, which is actually our local species. Yampi is one of the only edible true yams or diascorias that are found in Belize commonly, and it's native to Belize, and it was a traditional crop here for thousands of years. So those come into the market within the next couple of months, and it's a small yam. It looks like more like a sweet potato. It's more smooth skin, where the other yams are very bumpy and warty looking. Dragon fruit or pitaya, great fruit, very easy to grow. So ground covers are very important. I'm not going to go into them very much, but you have all these different layers. The most important one probably is the ground cover layer. Keeping the ground covered at all times is very important to these type of systems. So if you don't have a ground cover, then you're going to want to have mulch of some type. If you don't want to plant, living mulch, you're going to want to have dried leaves or dried grass or straw or something to cover the ground. So examples of this would be perennial peanut, sweet potato, oregano, mimosa, Okinawa spinach, local pumpkin, squash, cannavelia. So one of the best, in my opinion, would be perennial peanut as a ground cover. It's not an edible. It does have an edible flower, but for the most part, it's just a multifunctional plant. It's nitrogen fixing. It suppresses weeds. It makes a very nice, short plant that's very easy to maintain, and it's great to have between your fruit trees. I believe in the garden over here, I know they did last year, they have perennial peanut as the ground cover in this demonstration garden over here. So you can check that out. Sweet potato is another one. It's very easy to grow. I mentioned that cassava is the highest carbohydrate yield per acre in the world. Sweet potato is the highest calorie yield per acre in the world, because sweet potato has edible leaves also. Well, cassava does as well. But the sweet potato leaf is very nutritious, and the potato itself is one of the most nutritious staple crops on earth. So by combining the leaf and the potato, you have a very, very nutritious crop in general. You can harvest 30% of the sweet potato leaves before the tubers are produced, and you won't affect production. So the leaves are to me, the tastiest leaves you can eat. It's always eaten cooked. You can steam it or boil it or add it to soups, but it's a very nutritious and very tasty leaf that's eaten similar to callaloo or chaya. So it's a great crop that many people should eat. The sweet potato leaves pretty much are only, I commonly see here, eaten by the Chinese and Taiwanese community. It's not a common thing in Belize, even though sweet potato is native to Belize. Most of the people who eat the leaves are from Southeast Asian communities typically. But it's something everyone should do. If you grow sweet potato, try the leaves. You typically harvest the new leaves, not the older leaves, but the new growth in the actual vine tip, similar to callaloo, where you take the whole new growth. So sweet potato is very fast growing and very rewarding. You can see here, this is a bed I made I loosened the soil and put some dried grass here. And 2 months later, after I put the cuttings, full. So it's very quick growing. It smothers all the other weeds. It's a great ground cover. And there's many different varieties of sweet potatoes. Just like all this stuff, you have tons of variation. So that's all I'm going to cover now. I have more stuff, but we didn't get to that because of little difficulties in the beginning. But if you have any questions or want to ask me anything, we can do some questions now, and I'll walk off to the side after I'm done. And if you want to talk to me and ask some more questions, feel free.
Are you willing to share a copy of your presentation?
Yeah, sure. Huh? I think they're going to do some, they're going to make it available, I think. Yeah. Any more questions?
I was told by someone that when you plant peanut in a certain area, you shouldn't put other crops there because it attracts the kind of fungus that will go into your other crops.
Well,
Like peanuts. Is that true?
the one I'm recommending is not actual peanut that you eat. It's perennial peanut, which doesn't produce peanuts. It's in the same genus as peanut. It's Arachis, but peanut is grown as an annual crop where it grows and you harvest it. This is not actually producing peanuts at all. It's just a ground cover that you'd plant for its ability to control the weeds, to bring fertility to your soil. I haven't heard that about edible peanuts, but it could be true, so I'm not sure. But this, as a ground cover, is great with other plants. This helps your other plants grow very well. But I would not recommend the perennial peanut in a regular vegetable garden with tomatoes and carrots and cabbage. It's too aggressive. It'd be better around fruit trees and like shrubs like moringa and chaya and bigger plants like that.
Guava in Florida, when you prune them, sometimes you get flowers 30 to 60 days later, unless you can have almost year-round fruit production to keep them pruned. Is that how you're tropical?
Yep. Yeah, that's a great topic to bring up. Different trees, especially guava, you can force them to fruit or enable them to fruit off-season by pruning. So if you are watering the plants, if you're in a drier area that has more of a dry season, you can also withhold water. So if you really want guavas to produce, if you prune the tree back and withhold water, like stop watering the plant for a month during the dry season, especially like towards the north where you have a longer dry season, that'll actually force the plants to flower. So if you withhold water or you heavily prune the plants, it can shock the plants into producing. Any more questions? I don't have any good books for Belize specifically, but a great book that talks a lot about the perennial vegetables, which is not as common of a topic. It has a lot that would work in Belize, but it has other ones for other climates, but it lists what climate it grows in. It's called Perennial Vegetables, and it's by Eric Townsmeyer's the author. That's a very good book, and it goes more into the stuff like some of the techniques and setting up the garden more and into more of the perennial vegetables. I think there's a pretty good array of fruit trees already in Belize, and you can get a good example of what's here already, where the perennial vegetables are something that's a little less known. So I think the next presenter is ready to go on, so I'm going to step off to the side. If you have any more questions, just please, step over. All right.